Hello to everyone, whether you're watching this on video or listening to it in the podcast form. With you again today, and my guest today, Brian.
Yes, this is Brian here. Nice to meet you.
Thanks for coming in. Now, Brian, I've known for quite a few years. By trade, you're an engineer.
That's right.
As in a hardware engineer, not a software engineer. But one of the key things we want to talk about is something that we've talked about on and off over the years. One of the things you're involved with is a group that looks at ways to change or improve democracy, how people are involved. So tell us a bit about the name of the group and what the goals behind it are.
Oh, the group name is called Designing Open Democracy, and the goal behind the group is helping people come together to discuss on various ways that democracy itself can be improved. And this is not just in what issues should be out there, but more about the fundamentals of how the voting system should work, how media fairness could be done to improve the diversity of political opinions in society, as well as how do you sort through upgrade a system that allows for everybody's views to be heard, and especially with what Nicholas Groen told me, the considered opinion of the population, rather than the short media sound bites that seems to drive the political narrative these days.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing, because most of the time when people start talking about politics generally, or specifically, I'd be really dubious. Like if I was on the internet and I saw someone saying, I want to fix democracy. I'm okay, here's a fascist. What they mean is, I'd default to thinking someone meant, how can I stop people I don't like playing any sort of role in democracy? And again, that's the internet's poisoned me. That's the sort of thing. If I saw someone on the internet saying, I'm going to fix democracy, I'd have real concerns that what they mean is, I'm going to change it so only my view gets heard. So how do you come at that sort of thing to make it clear to people that isn't what you're doing?
I think it's kind of easy to create a group that tries to discuss about it, but it's hard to make people passionate about democracy. And the best way you could describe it is that we need to encourage the people to support the umpires, not just the two footy teams in a footy game. And that makes sense?
That's a good way to do it. So, yeah, you're looking for the fairest and best informed outcome, not necessarily pushing the agenda of one team over another team.
Yes, and it's kind of in some ways, if we're talking about game design, you're almost trying to do the opposite of creating game design, where in the sense of game design, you're looking for the most exciting engagement of the players, but in this case it's less about creating the most engaging gameplay and more about something that's able to remain stable and focus over the long-term period. And but perhaps it's not too far-fetched if you think about MMOs. Where in the case of MMOs, yes, you're aiming for the most exciting battles and so on, but you're also aiming to maintain a sense of fairness and what do you say, helping everybody to feel engaged in the entire environment. So perhaps game design in games still applies to society, but more in the sense of creating massive multiplayer online games, but for society.
Because we were having a bit of a conversation just before starting this recording about game design and how you could see society through game design. And your traditional video games that have a narrative and an end point, that's not what we're talking about, because that's really, those type of games are winners and losers.
Yes, definitely.
And whereas you say with the massive multiplayer online games and similar ones, RPGs and whatever, the journey is either as much as the end point, or in the case of some of the open world games, you literally can continue to explore the possibilities of the world. You don't have to have an end, even though a lot of them are very, you could look at some of them, they're very aggressive winners and losers, like when you're doing Warcraft and stuff.
Yes,
and forming clans. That's where you get to see politics in action.
Definitely.
in computer games. Okay, and I'll bring up, I'll extend the gaming metaphor a bit with politics, and I think where sometimes my mistrust comes in. Are you familiar with the online game Eve?
Oh yes, I am very familiar, but more like as an outside game.
Yeah, me too. I'm familiar with it from the outside.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, Eve's a science fiction online game, and it attempts to be quite realistic. People build up resources, and you can end up with huge battleships in space. You form huge alliances. One of the things that's different to a lot of games, if you die in this game, that's it, you dead. Your character's gone, you lose all your assets and whatnot. So when someone builds up valuable assets, they tend to defend them pretty strong, and they get very cautious. And there are some wild stories. Like if you want to, you probably find them by searching online, biggest events in Eve online. And there are these things that have ended up involving hundreds of, if not thousands of people around the world, and massive all or nothing battles between different alliances.
Or
and
corporations.
they can be a corporation within the game, and they go on for hours, if not days, until they hit a resolution point. And because when there's been a couple of these in the last couple of years, they've spiraled out of control basically and involved a huge number of people. So you end up at the end of it, hundreds of people lost all their assets in the game.
Thousands and thousands of dollars.
Yeah, and they actually, it cost them real world money to build some of them up. And you can have real money in this game, and it gets involved. And what happened, and this is the actual bit I wanted to bring in, someone built up trust as a bank in the game, right?
Yep.
And they had to establish their credentials, and they were neutral, and people's money was safe with this online in-game bank, and it ran for years. It really built and built and built till it was this massive trusted institution, and it had a significant percentage of the game's economy under its control.
Okay.
And that involved, I think it literally involved millions of real world dollars in value. It was a significant chunk of the game's economy. And one day the person running the bank pulled the plug. Just went, ha ha ha, you suckers, I played the long game. I spent several years gaining your trust, and then I took everything. And if that isn't an analogue for the real world of politics, I don't know what is. I think we all have seen that thing where you think someone's representing your interests, you think someone is trustworthy and maybe at least neutral.
Yeah.
And they're just after power and their own benefit, and you trust the wrong person and they screw you over. So I feel like what you're looking at with open democracy, because it's not pushing a political ideology, would it be fair to say that's one of the things you're trying to minimise the chance of happening, improving the nature of the democracy so that power mad people can't subvert it?
I would definitely say that you'd have to design to deal with the fact that people are trying to exploit it, and so yes, designing open democracy is not there to push any particular model or system, but is there to act, if it makes sense, like a forum for people who want to think of ways to design a better system that could defend itself against these all competing interests. If that makes sense. And that's why we're trying to reach out to lots of different organizations that are trying to push different ideas. And maybe even tries to, if we see a particular idea that is not represented enough, maybe try to encourage people to start an organization for it. So, for example, there's in the field of e-democracy, and you might have heard of these two parties that were trying to push for political reform of the voting system. There's one called My Vote, and there's another called Flux, and they're both based on the idea of an electronic democracy, if that makes sense, where you can have everybody representing, contributing part of the decision making of what issues actually passes or not, rather than electing a representative to power.
So, what are we talking about here? Because my warning lights immediately go on if anyone talks about
electronic democracy, yes.
Online voting, basically,
Yes.
because we've seen far too many cases, and I'm thinking particularly of the United States here, where the machines used in the online voting are not trustworthy, are not auditable, and the companies selling the polling machines are run by people who've exposed extremely partisan views, and the lack of auditability and traceability with the electronic voting and oversight is incredibly off-putting. But you weren't actually talking about electing representatives. It was trying to get a real idea of what issues people cared about.
In this particular case, I'm more talking about outreaching to organization and bring them to the discussion tables and so on. And so, yes, to me, I do believe there is a concern in the fundamental nature of using electronic voting. But however, in the case of improving discussion and improving the public awareness of options out there, it is important that we get everybody into the table that are trying to change democracy for the better, even if that includes people pushing for electronic type of democracy. And perhaps it could work in, say, Estonia, where everybody uses smart cards to verify their identity. But that's a discussion for another time. However, there are other ideas out there that doesn't go towards a electronic voting kind of system. Do you remember talking about citizen juries?
Oh yeah, this was an interesting one. This is definitely something I wanted to talk about in this, because Brian and I have talked about this before. And a citizen jury is not about court cases, as it might sound. Explain a citizen jury, Brian.
When people talk about juries, first thing they usually think about is in criminal court cases where you have a group of people that are randomly selected to help decide on the guilty or non-guilty status of a defendant. In the context of a citizen juries, it's still using the similar principle of using random selection, but in the case of a citizen juries, before helping to decide on issues and whether an issue should be implemented or not as law. And the benefit of that approach, compared to, say, standard election representatives, is that you're getting a proper cross-section of society as long as it is statistically sampled correctly. And it doesn't have to be a massive population. It could be a somewhat smaller, say, even down to 100 if you get your sampling right. And you could tell that it does work because we use it for jury systems as well as for scientific research. You can't do the scientific experiment on everybody in Australia, but you could certainly take a representative sample of the population.
Yeah, and so, that's where it becomes jury. Like in a criminal case, it's a jury of your peers. So this is talking about getting a randomly selected group, but properly sampled group.
A homogenized sample.
To discuss the issues of the day and to try and work out policy positions. And it's I love it as an idea. I think the bigger and wider it goes, the more unwieldy it gets and the more difficult to manage. And I also admit, I have to think, at the actual running the country level, it would be a little bit difficult to administer. But I think your biggest problem would be politicians aren't going to give up power. But if the idea gains some weight, what it possibly could be, instead of politicians talking down from on high on this is the policy I'm going to introduce on you, if they actually had a real trustworthy sample of people and they could see their discussions in action and they could see where the majority felt a particular thing could go, it would actually then be in the politicians' interest to go, okay, well, our party position was this, but I saw that group in action and they went in a completely different direction, and that's given me a pretty strong indication if I go against that, it's probably going to hurt me electorally down the line. Whereas if you do have a properly representative group talking through an issue, if you're feeling very noble, you'll say the politician knows the right thing to do because they've seen the people. If you're feeling cynical, you can go, well, they saw where the votes are. But either way could lead to a good result in that the politicians have a genuine, or as close to a genuine understanding as they can get of, the mood of the people. And one could hope that it would lead to better policy decisions or, generally fairer. Although, of course, it always gets difficult. Sometimes, and we've seen this a couple of times in history, politicians have needed to make a choice that's not supported by a significant majority. And that's things like desegregation in the US, Malcolm Fraser allowing an influx of refugees in the 70s. If it was put to a popular vote, that isn't the way the popular vote would have gone. But the politician has gone, actually have to bite the bullet on this, and the right decision to make is this one. And so even though there's some short-term or maybe even medium-term electoral pain out of this, I need to make that decision. But yeah, again, then we're coming down to what are the quality of people in politics as well.
Like I think one thing right to think about is that this isn't really a very new idea at all. Have I mentioned that this very system was used by the Athenians in Greece?
I was about to say this I feel like I've heard of this style of the forum being used in ancient Greece. Yes. So yeah, it is not a new. Although some people would see it as very radical. It's not radical in the sense of new and untried, but you could see it as a significant departure from how decisions are made now. But it's not new and untried.
Yes. So if you want to see our organization of designing open democracy, it's about recognizing that these changes don't happen immediately. That happens when you have a mass of people with these kinds who are interested in changing society, pushing for various different ideas and giving, most importantly, the public options for where they will want to take their society towards. So it's not about in some ways, a lot of people, when they try to tackle revolutionary ideas or push for ideas, they often take a very top-bottom prescriptive approach of saying, here's I'm the Messiah, here's the idea, and you take it, and so on. But I think, in general, if you think of how society evolved organically and how Athenian Greece come to this citizen juries, organically, it all comes through multiple layers of reforms, and in some ways our current society of doing this in Australia, at least, of having a bicameral parliament, comes as an evolutionary adaptation all the way back to the kings and queen ages. You couldn't convince the kings and queens to do democracy, but you could certainly give them the options to consider maybe devolving some power so they don't get their ass kicked.
Yeah, and that's where you get things like the Magna Carta, where British royalty devolved some authority to the people, although that was the nobles. And then you had the English Civil War, which purportedly was going to take all the power from the nobility and to the people. And so you had people like Cromwell being very popular with his army, and then as soon as they'd basically broken the power of the monarchy, he's just gone to all the rabble you're not getting anything.
And even then, at that point, I think it wasn't just to the general public, it was only if you have land. Then
it was landowners, yes. England only gave voting rights to non-landowners quite recently. And I think that was also the case in the formation of the United States. Initially, only landowners had voting rights. And it gradually devolved to more and more people were able to be an active part of the democracy. So yeah, and this is a thing that is somewhat fascinating to me, and I know I'm guilty of it as well, but I see it a lot. I feel like a lot of people, when they look at the world now, they have this view as this is how it's always been.
Like it's everything seems constant until it isn't.
Yes, I mean, well, people look at in Australia, our current political system with two major political groups, the Labor Party, who are nominally the left, though they're very centre, and the Liberal National Party coalition, who are the Conservative Party, and people go like, you'll never change that. The Liberal Party was only formed in the mid-20th century. There were different political parties that split and broke up and reformed, and people act as if this is immovable, what we have now. But the first half of the 20th century was completely different to what we have now. And the same is for virtually everywhere. In the US they think it's Democrats and Republicans. And you go, well, no, there were other political parties.
And in some ways they were the opposite of each other before at a certain point as well.
Yeah, it's certainly, if you look at certainly the social policies now, where the Democrats are regarded as progressive and the Republicans are regarded as conservative, you go back to the period of the Civil War, the Democrats were the slave owners, Lincoln was a Republican.
Yep.
The Republicans were, as the name suggested, people who thought the Republic was very important, and as still living memory, having conflict with England over if America had a right to exist. And the Republican Party was very much the party of the common people. Things shift, and there were completely different political parties. The Whigs was my favourite, WHIGS. I don't even know what their ideology was, I just like the name, Whig. Brian's enjoying a Bundaberg.
I do.
It's. I just want to throw in, I think that's like one of the last independent soft drink manufacturers in Australia.
Really?
Yep, it is.
Okay.
You see, it says it on the bottle. This not sponsored, but they should sponsor us because they make it. Australian family owned. It's a family owned drink bottler from Queensland.
I have to keep that in mind.
Almost everything else we see on the shelves, no matter what brand is on it, is either a Coke or a Pepsi product.
Pretty much.
And
I mean, we've got to sponsor our overlord somehow.
yeah. I'm not sure how much Bundaberg has sponsorship money floating around. Hey, maybe Bundaberg rum could. Speaking of, I've got my tiki cocktail happening here.
Yeah.
I'd be okay with a Bundaberg rum sponsorship. Fine Australian product. Look, that brings me to think. I found a thing literally just before we started recording this on Twitter. And this was by someone, I have no idea who they are, but someone I follow did the old retweet. And, it's gone and lost it. What? Oh, man, the Twitter app that just automatically refreshes and does shite. And this has completely ruined me because this is not a person I follow, and I would have to find it. So your turn
but
to
you
talk,
can
Brian.
always show it later on the screen.
Yeah, your turn to talk, Brian, while I try and find it.
Okay.
We were talking about how things change. And I think with the open democracy movement, I reckon that would be one of your biggest hurdles. That I've seen it. People get stuck in the mindset how things are now are how they have always been. And they're not. Even like little things like people say, you can't change the date of Australia Day. It's the diggers fought for that. The current date has only been a national consistent holiday since the 1990s. Like, that's so recent, and yet people get this idea in their head that is somehow inviolable. And it's clearly not, because over the 20th century, different dates in different states, it changed so many times. The idea that any particular date for Australia Day is carved in stone is absolutely ridiculous. How have you seen in the stuff you've done, how big a hurdle is it to just get people to think that something different can happen?
It is definitely a massive hurdle, like in the sense that most people are not aware of all these other options and the things that has happened in the past. And one way we hope to like overcome this is simply by reaching out to like public influencers and just like get people to maybe educate themselves about what has happened in the past and what like people can do to help push through all of these changes of whatever they feel like will make society better.
Yeah, because I think, every now and then people say, oh, you're too radical. No matter what your actual political beliefs are, when you're trying to push for some significant change, a lot of people say, oh, that's too radical, as if that's a bad thing. But the sort of massive inertia at the centre only moves at all because of radical action on the fringes of it. And maybe it never moves all the way to those radical points, but that's how things change, because really motivated people go, I'm going to really push for the thing that everyone says is impossible.
There are organizations out there definitely that are trying to push for like a bit more changes, but they're more engaging towards the politicians. Like, for example, I think there was one called New Democracy.
Yeah.
And their role is really to help engage with politicians and expose them to the idea of using citizen juries, not to replace the politicians themselves, but to act as an additional toolset within the politician's arsenal to help gauge what is the best option to engage with the public in an informed sense. And that's really, when you're saying about how, like, things like why would politicians ever touch it, in some ways they are already using, they're just not able to use it as effectively as they could.
Yeah. But here's the discussion point I want to bring up. I did find it. As a guy who calls himself Max Black, I have no idea if that's his real name, has a website called maxblackhole.com.
Max Black?
Yeah. And he describes himself as an activist and a YouTuber. I'll have to try and find his YouTube channel. Living on Gunwall land, tweet mainly about Australian politics and fight bigotry. Hashtag Black Lives Matter, so do trans lives. He's from Canberra. Anyway, Max Black, he said, he feels we're in a dangerous situation. How he summarises it. Murdoch spent 20 years monopolising the media, running hate and fear columns that tore our communities apart. Problem's not the left or right dynamic anymore, or even rich versus poor dynamic. Real problem is those that believe the propaganda machine and those that don't. Machine made us hate each other to the point of utter viciousness. Dialogue and debate is impossible. We've reached a point of total impasse on everything. This is by design. At the same time, the government has been slowly eroding our rights under the guise of anti-terrorism. At least 58 laws over this period have passed that weakened our rights. We're now a de facto police state. Journalists are silenced. Your data's monitored. We have concentration camps. Okay, well, police state's a bit of hyperbole that I'm probably guilty of using from time to time. The rest is statement of facts. Journalists are threatened. All our data's being monitored. And our government's running concentration camps. Finally, we have no less than 3 imminent disasters on the horizon. Environmental devastation, economic collapse from wealth inequality, and mass job loss from automation. Now he says, from now on, he says he's speculating. As soon as one or all of these disasters hits, the media will immediately place blame on political opponents, and the police state will liquidate them. History has seen this before. The result is only an obedient population will survive, and the government has total control. Point is, they're actively not solving the impending disasters because the crisis will give them the opportunity for total power. Even if only half of this is true, consequences of not making our government media accountable again are catastrophic. And he says, this is for all of us. I refuse to believe even the people who support our government are happy with the direction we're going. Our communities alone will take 20 years to heal and rebuild trust and faith again. I've said before and I'll say it again, if we want our children to have a hopeful future, we're the ones who will have to sacrifice to make it happen. Nothing short of a national general strike demanding media and government accountability will stop us going over the cliff. It'll hurt a lot, but it has to be done because the price of failure is everything. The key thing that I thought tied in with what we're talking about, and I do believe this bit, that, and definitely the Murdoch media has been horribly guilty of this around the world, driving fear, mistrust and division to the point where it feels like dialogue is basically impossible. Despite all the shouty things I do on videos, if I believed someone was someone who had very different views to me was genuinely open to discussion and reasoned debate, I'd be more than happy to do it. It's just the part of the tactic that's really grown, particularly in the last 10 years, is to talk about, I want to debate, and they don't want to debate. They just want to shout things at you. They do not want to exchange ideas. They do not want to consider new information. I'd like to think I am willing to consider that, but when I see people who are just engaging in bad faith, they say, let's have an open debate. And all they're literally going to do is throw talking points at you and get shouting, and it's of no value whatsoever.
And in some ways, it's almost like distracting you from your ability of reaching out to the general public.
Yeah. If the people who shout loudest about, you should debate, are actually just partisans who don't have even the slightest intention of engaging in good faith, and if they suck up all your time and energy,
and mental bandwidth,
and bloody physical health sometimes, you don't have time for engaging. Like, I think the majority of the population is reachable with some of these ideas we've been talking about. Like, maybe there's a better way to get our views across. Maybe there's a better way to have our democracy more clearly reflect what people actually want. But the people controlling public discourse, it's in their vested interest to not let go of any of that power. In the group, have you actually discussed, like, has that come up? People have gone, this is all a pipe dream because the people in power are evil as hell. And I'd put this, again, people know my politics are shamelessly left-wing in Australia. That means I would most definitely support the Labor Party over the Liberal National Coalition on almost everything. Certainly, generally in government, I want a Labor government, not a Conservative government. But when I say about people who won't give up power, I absolutely think the Labor Party is just as bad. Is that something you've talked about? How to deal with the fact that the people who control the political system now have no vested interest in giving up any of their power, and they're pretty aggressive about holding on to their power. Have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, well, like that, it has popped into the conversation time to time again, and in some ways, like, it is one of the biggest issue when it comes to how do you even promote any of these ideas around. But then again, I just have to point to how history has changed in that sense. Like, if you're gonna be an activist for these kind of things, you can't be a one-day activist kind of thing. You can't push all your might on one day to push this particular change. It has to be an evolving kind of like progress where you're reaching out to all these people with the keys to power, and in some ways like understanding what motivates them, and also showing them options that will serve everybody's interest. And in that sense, it's a very boring way to look in politics, but like, if you want to change things, you have to change it at the microcosm level.
Yeah, and this is a thing that's come up when we've had a conversation before. I've thought, particularly with citizen juries, if you were interested in engendering change, you might have more effect at like the local government level.
Which is exactly what like Neo Democracy and other like organizations are trying to do, is like they're trying to help talk with politicians and local councils of, here's a tool set you got. Maybe you might want to say, try this out. For example, I think there was a council in Ballarat that was absolutely corrupt and they had to shut it down. Yep. And so what they did was they actually implemented a citizen juries for a short time until they could get a full-on council going. And so in some ways, it's when you engage with those in power and show them this is the tool you have and it will be in your interest, like they may actually use it. It may be a surprising thing, but they may actually use it. And if you look at Labour and Liberals, in some ways they're also using citizen juries in the context of focus group. So the problem with focus groups is, again, they're they don't really have much power, and like the way the politicians are using the tools of focus group is not as a way of finding like what is the informed opinion of the public, but rather what are the sound bites or the ways you could use to test like your attack on the population at large.
Yeah, that's my cynical mind comes in there as well.
Yeah.
The politicians using focus groups rather than them having an open and genuine agenda of how could we best serve the people, I feel like they're going like, how can we manipulate the people?
Yeah.
Let's start with this group, find out what they talk about, and yeah, exactly as you were saying, find out what buzzwords and sound bites will sway people, what they care about, what they don't care, and then they use it for evil rather than good.
But it does show how effective the tool of citizen juries can be. It's like guns. It really depends on how you use it. Like whether you're using it as a security guard or you use it to rob a person. So in the case of the citizen juries, it is really effective if you want to use it as a way of like, how do you manipulate the public with 30-second sound bites? Or if you want to use it correctly, how do you use it to like, help like find the informed opinion of the population?
Yeah, and again, hopefully, how can you improve the lot of the public? How can you help them be more informed? Because that Max Black guy I was reading from then, I thought what he really hit the nail on the head, what we've seen with the concentration of media ownership into the hands of a small number of largely very evil people. They've actively promoted division. I remember reading something a few years...
not to interrupt too much, but the other advantage of being a big media conglomerate is that, like, when it comes to getting your views out as, like, individuals in the whole population, it is extremely difficult because, well, like, how do you get your views out? Like, you either have to advertise, or you have to own a lot of newspaper, or you need to find a way to use memes really well.
Yes.
That it spreads out. So that's actually one way that, like, things called politicians out and changes is when you have new medium come into play, like, say, Twitter and so on, but the old guard just does not understand the power, then the new upstart, like, politician, like, say, Obama, will actually be able to use it as a potential exploit to reach out to the entire population and get them to move towards where they want to, like, to get them to vote them into power. So it is fundamentally, I believe, about information asymmetry. And like, the problem with current election is that anybody that wants to get a bill across is fighting against this information asymmetry, and the only way you could get through it is if you find an exploit or a way to go around it, or you accept donor monies from big corporation, and then they give you the money, which you could then do advertisement and then reach out to everybody. So, and if you're looking at citizen juries, one way you could look at it is that they're a way of addressing bandwidth, of mental bandwidth of the ordinary population, so they could tackle lots of issues. And not just like mental bandwidth of the ordinary population, but the mental bandwidth of politicians themselves. So, because I'm like, not all of them are bad people, like as the general saying goes, but like once you get into power, you have to fight and compromise, and it's like a evolving game of like it's like having a multiple evolving game matches. It's the first people that get through could be good people, but when you run it through the cycle, it's the way the system filters people out, that you only get certain people that, well, play the game well in that sense. And so that's where you have that kind of issue. But you have, like, say, citizen juries, they're constantly churning through, so every game is a nil game for each person that's going through. You can't really manipulate it unless you could manipulate the, say, a random number generator.
Yeah.
And also they're able to have a much bigger mental bandwidth to tackle lots of different laws, because you don't have to have just one citizen jury. So you could have a whole different panel of citizen juries and lots of different potential laws filtering through to eventually get passed. But with our current system, where you have just one big parliament, then all that laws is going through a bottleneck, and that's potentially also slowing down like the ability of the government to react, especially in our modern electronic like society, where laws could be so slow that it can't really deal with, like, say, Uber coming in and upending the whole like where we deal with like ride sharing and so on.
Yeah.
And the gig economy.
Yeah, and as you're saying, because the one of the biggest problems with politicians is when the central part of their existence becomes holding on to power. The American system, I think, is particularly bad. Once you get elected to any of their state or federal Congress or Senate, once you're there, an enormous chunk of your time is spent on fundraising for the next election. So much of your time is focused on just maintaining power. And in case we didn't make it clear, the idea with the citizens' juries, they're not there forever. There's like this group is assembled for a fixed period of time to achieve a particular thing, and then that's disbanded.
Yep.
And then the next citizen jury is also randomly selected. So, as Brian was saying, it's like there's a zero-sum game for them. When someone goes into a citizen jury, there's no concept of what can I do to maintain my place here, because you are not maintaining your place. You will be gone. You assume. So the goal becomes, okay, I'm now part of this group who are looking at this issue or these following issues. What happens within the group to get the most productive outcome, ideally.
And as I think you may have mentioned to me once, like the people we should be most suspicious of is the one that wants to get the power.
Oh yeah, no. The people who most want to be in power and run the country are arguably the people least safe to do it. Even, look, seriously, the politician you love more, and again, if you're a lefty like me, you get people who go about, oh, Trump's awful, Obama was so good. And yeah, on an objective level, I think that's true. But also, you've got to remember, with Obama, he's a narcissist enough to sit down and go, you know who should run everything? Out of everyone? Me. And there's something really narcissistic about, oh, you know who should be telling everyone what to do? This guy. And even when you look at Obama, he was a comparatively very junior person in that political structure. And so he, even within his own party, he had to be narcissistic enough to say, I can be better than all of these people who've had a lot bigger build-up to this than I have. Now, objectively, I think you could argue that maybe he was better than those other people. But you can't get past this massive narcissism involved in saying, I'm literally the best person to do this. And you've got to take be a little bit wary about someone who's so convinced they're the best person to have the most power. So, and a citizen jury doesn't have that because there's no power for them to hold on to. They're part of a process, and then that group disperses, and you have a new citizen jury.
Definitely. Like, in some ways, it's also changing the way that citizens, see themselves as part of the system. In our current system, we're kind of like the customer. And, like, we try to hire, like, the next, like, company, boss or employee and so on, and just hope that they will do their job. But in the case of a citizen jury, the fundamental way we look into the government is that, like, it is a civic duty of everybody to represent and do the job well. Kind of like how we are all forced to vote.
Yeah, well, that's another interesting thing about democracy. When I look at stuff, there is, certainly in Western democracies, there is a belief that the more people vote, the less the vote's going to go in favour of conservative parties. You look in the US, the Republicans are absolutely shameless about how they try to subvert people's ability to vote, particularly poorer people and minorities, because they believe those people won't vote for them. So they go to extraordinary lengths to disenfranchise
and
voters.
disengage.
Yeah,
Especially.
and disengage. And there is a belief, even if you didn't aggressively try to stop certain people from voting, there's a belief that in a complete, and I don't know what sort of historical data there is to back this up, but I know it's consistent. It's certainly, I'll limit it to the English-speaking world because I don't speak other languages and don't know what they're. But certainly I've seen this repeatedly in England, Australia, America. There is a belief that in a totally voluntary voting system, even if you didn't actively disenfranchise something, that would work in favour of conservative politicians because their supporters are more motivated to vote. But there's a belief that when the great unwashed are pushed to vote, they're less likely to vote along conservative lines. And whether that's true or not, you definitely do see people pushing conservative agendas more aggressively trying to stop people from voting or disengage them from the voting process, and you get more people on the progressive side trying to get people to register to vote, take them to the polling booth. I mean, because you can't control how people vote when they get there, but you see it around, certainly the English-speaking Western democracies, a belief if more people get to vote, they're less likely to vote along conservative lines. So, which is another reason that I think you'd get some resistance to any process that makes people feel more engaged in democracy, because there are certain people in the halls of power.
I am very aware of it. Like, for example, like how state lines can be drawn really, really weirdly in America. What was it called?
Gerrymandering.
Yes.
The electoral zones, like, it's wild. If you've never looked into it, I think criminal's the only way to describe it. And this has been done... Look, both sides do it, but in the last couple of decades, it's been done far more egregiously by the Republicans. They've changed the borders of voting districts to maximise their chances of winning. And look it up if you're unfamiliar with it, because there's some very good explainers online that show... with the same split of voters, just by changing how you count the votes, you can completely change the outcome of elections. You let the same people vote along the same lines, you don't interfere with anyone's ability to vote, but you change the boundaries of the electoral districts, and you can completely change the result of elections.
And that's exactly why I think it is important you have this high level discussion about how our democracy runs, is because, like, the problem with saying one party is good and one party is bad is that, like, if the system is designed with a flaw in such a way that to get the advantage you need to do a bad thing, then in some ways you have a really big incentive to do the bad thing or not get into power. And like, it has a very corrupting way of influencing people. Like, it's, what do you say? It's kind of like having a mafia or a Mexican cartel, in the sense of you have either lead or the bullet. Like, you either get some silver or you get shot. I think it's actually called silver bullet. Like, you
get the silver or you get the lead.
Yes, and so in the case of political parties, the political parties that want to do the right thing in a defective system either just dies off, and those that tries to do the right thing now does the wrong thing, but now... And so they're able to have some presence of doing the right thing, but then now they have this corrupting influence, which is going to start attracting the less savory kind of politicians into the realm of power. Yeah,
and again, while I'm never shy about expressing my own political leanings, I do thoroughly believe that no matter who is in power, they need a strong opposition. I've had people say, like, "Oh, will people ever agree?" No, people won't ever agree. People are different, and the two main divisions we see in the modern world are, quote unquote, conservative and progressive.
Yep. But even within there, the problem with having just two parties out there is that people's views are complex. You may be conservative in one aspect, but certainly not conservative in one other aspect.
Yes, there's economic policy, there's social policy,
And
there's foreign
probably
policy.
many other dimensions
Yes.
to it that you just cannot capture with two parties. And that's why, this is why you may want to have other ways, like a direct democracy, where people could decide on each issues based on to have a more granular control over the workings of the government by the people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but you kind of look at the way they behave. Even like I said, in Australia, I much prefer a Labor Party government to a Conservative government. But say a Labor Party got in, and say when they got in, they were everything I wanted in a government. They were pushing all the policies that I wanted, and I'm like, oh, I'm so happy. And if the opposition just crumbled to dust, and then this Labor government kept steamrolling election after election, at a certain point, A, they become complacent, and B, you get people in business who go, well, they're the only game in town, so we got to bribe them, and so both complacency and corruption inevitably creep in. The closer you get to single party control, autocracy, or go the whole way into fascism, whatever, the more harmful it is to the populace at large. So even though I'm absolutely 100% open about which party I support, if they're in government, there needs to be an effective opposition.
Well, somebody's got to maintain the machinery.
Yeah, they're going to be lazy and corrupt if they just automatically get... No, and that's just humans. And maybe a lot... if I was being all sort of starry-eyed, I'd say maybe a lot of the people in the government would maintain some level of integrity.
Yeah.
But there's got to be people who've got their hands on power and they like it. And no matter how they started out, as the old saying goes, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We've seen it time and time again. Nobody maintains their integrity when there's nothing to... There's no tension that forces them to act with integrity. There's not someone who can replace them. If you have power and there's no one practical to replace you, then you're going to get really dismissive of everyone else and take a lot for granted, and that's not good for the population.
And again, that's sort of why I'm interested in helping people also consider citizen juries, because again, the idea of going through and replacing the people that decides in power kind of helps mitigate that.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. And I think we come back to the biggest challenge to significant structural change is the people who have vested interests in the current structural system, and they don't want to give up the power they have. And you get, the power behind the throne. People like Murdoch, the media who've been feeding the division and dissension and profiting from it, they don't want a more effective, engaged populace. They want a scared, isolated, divided populace.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah, because it sells things. I mean, I remember reading something on a progressive website years ago. It was a little article, basically headlined, "I watched an entire day's Fox News programming so you don't have to." And the most interesting thing that came out of it for me, the person said, look, when I started, I expected it to feed into what I said. This would all just be, and this is when Obama was president, I expected it to all be pro-Republican, anti-Obama stuff. And I thought that's all they would say. It would just be Obama bad, Republicans good. And there was certainly a lot of that. But he said what he noticed as the day wore on, the central theme wasn't so much Republican versus Democrat. It was fear. They just kept pushing, you're in danger. Is this predator going to come to your house? And there was always the subtext of Republicans will keep you safe and Democrats are the reason things are bad. But the overt message continually was fear and division. It was like, and because people can't function rationally if they're scared, and people can't collectively bring about change if they're divided. So the people who do have a significant investment in the power structures, they don't give it up in a hurry. And, you know, one way is to hold it by force, which usually has a limited effectiveness.
And it's also hard to control the subsequent event, which leaves room for bad actors as well to get in.
But so what they mainly do is bloody distract the populace. It's absolutely, even the talk in the last US presidential election about Russian interference, and it did become clear Russia was more interested in a Trump presidency than a Clinton presidency. But when I really looked at what did these people who were either actively Russian agents or were paid by Russian interests to do particular things, what did they do? And yes, there was partisan pro-Trump, anti-Clinton stuff, but what they also did on things like Facebook and Twitter was just push really partisan views. Sometimes the left or progressive saying Trump's evil and wrong, and the central thing they were doing was manipulating this division between people, basically making it harder for people to get along.
To engage in rational and constructive dialogues.
And it appears that their view, and I think this is probably a solid view, an American population that was fighting with itself is weakened and is less likely to be a threat to Russia. So there did seem to be a strong thing of a leaning towards pro-Trump, anti-Clinton stuff. But even more than that,
but
was
that's
just
not the main point.
Create division.
Sure.
They pushed really partisan left-wing progressive stuff, and they pushed really partisan right-wing conservative stuff. And the idea was like, if they'd only gone all one way, just put all their effort into putting pro-Trump, pro-conservative, pro-bigot stuff, that would have affected one section of the population. But they did the other one as well. And they were just... There was a view
but
that...
it sort of makes sense.
Yeah.
If your aim is to attack the population, you don't attack the population by tackling only one half. You attack the whole population.
Yeah, and they turned people against you. And back to that Max Black thing I was reading, the discourse has been poisoned to the extent it's incredibly hard to have a good faith conversation. And I know my caution is there, and I can think of
So perhaps the main game is not like destroying, but more like instilling paralysis in the public discourse.
Not letting it get in. The fact that there's so much division and so much internal fighting that they can't do anything external.
And if you have a really powerful military, but the people behind it is constantly fighting each other, then it's kind of...
Yeah. All the tension is inwardly focused instead of outwardly focused. And that did seem to be a strong motivation. And it also did seem to be quite effective. It's so hard to have discourse. And I know I have made mistakes a couple times when someone has posted a YouTube comment or put something on Twitter or something, and the wording is basically exactly the same as what a troll would do. And I'm straight into, go to hell, piss off, whatever. And then they're like, well, why did you do that? And I went, well, you came in with this. And 9 times out of 10, when someone comes in like that, they have no interest in actual discussion. They're actually just there to cause a fight. They're just there to waste my time and wear me down. So I've taken to ignoring them. And then they're like, no, that honestly, genuinely wasn't what I was doing. And there have been a couple of times I've gone, okay, I've overreacted. And I've apologised to the person.
And perhaps that is part of their game as well.
Yeah. You can't have a good faith discussion because the majority of people with loud voices are acting completely in bad faith.
You know what that also reminds me? You're in part of the IT industry in some ways.
Yeah.
Like, you heard of the word DDoS. Like, I'm pretty sure the
Distributed denial of service attack.
That's right.
That's when you've probably heard them called denial of service attack. When a website goes down. See, when you go to a website, the simple version, when you go to a website, your computer's going through the internet and sending a request to the website saying, please give me information. And a website can handle a certain number of people doing that. Someone, usually with a bunch of PCs they've infected with a virus so they control them, their little zombie army of computers, and they get thousands upon thousands upon thousands of computers to send requests to the same website at exactly the same time, and they overwhelm the website's ability to respond, and it crashes. That's one of the more common attacks on websites. Just overwhelm them with requests, so they crash.
And you could try to mitigate against it by like shutting down channels and so on. But the problem here is that if you're a big enough website, you're still gonna lose a lot of like users that look like real users, and they are real users, but they're hard to distinguish from all the flood of fake users coming in.
That's a really good analogy. I'd not thought of that. This bullshit with the Murdoch media and the possible Russian provocateurs, and even just the bunch of bad faith wankers on the internet. It's a form of a denial of service attack. If you're trying to engage in something and you have to get all this bad faith crap at you all the time, it blanks out your ability to see genuine people. Yes. Because you just assume everything's a bad faith attack.
And you have to a certain extent.
Oh, to preserve your sanity, you have to.
Yep.
Because oh my God, they're non-stop.
But the problem with that is when you can't reach out to those that you could potentially change the views of, then like, or to be exposed to others who could change your views, then the entire purpose of having a dialogue breaks down, and that can be quite critical, especially during election season. And so, yeah, like, one way is that, like, if you're looking at the DDoS, how do they tackle these issues in the internet, which you could say is kind of similar to real life as well, is by having services like Cloudflare existing as an upper level, which actually monitors the entire flow of traffic. And how Cloudflare works is, when you do a DDoS, it's hard to do an actual distributed DDoS where you go everywhere and have everybody send at the same time. Instead, it's often in locked geographic areas, like say parts of Africa or parts of Europe and so on, sending lots of volume. And if you have this big overlooking view of the entire network, then you could say this person's sending so much data to like Australia, so we could cut off this entire quarantine, the entire area from sending data to the person in Australia, but then the person in Australia is still able to talk to other Australians and so on.
So almost as if we were able to find a reliable way to identify the sources of bad faith information, bad faith arguments, and say, look, I'm not kicking you off the internet, but I'm putting you on a list so that people who subscribe to this list know, okay, if stuff starts coming from this source, it's got a history of being unreliable or bad
so
faith,
in some
so
ways,
I filter it out.
You can't tackle this at an individual level. It really has to be like in a big systematic kind of like social infrastructure kind of sense.
Do you hear that, Facebook? We know how to fix it, okay? Hire us and we'll solve a problem. Because this is an ongoing problem that the social media
But who
sites
is going to do the more? Who's going to guard the internet, and can we trust the guards of the internet?
You can trust us. So okay, whether it's Bill Gates or the boys at Google or Zuckerberg or what's his name from Amazon, all these people with the big websites. Jeff Bezos. We just solve the problem. So like hire us. we can work. You've got nerds who can do algorithms. Hell, Brian's an engineer. He can design systems. I just know how to smell bullshit on people. So I can be the social engineer on that. And Brian's a hardware engineer. I'm a social engineer. I'm sure you've got software engineers.
I'm sure.
Yeah. I'm sure they've got one or two. They've got Google and Amazon and Facebook, they're going to have one or two software engineers to
fundamentally, this is not a role for like just engineers. This is a role for everybody to tackle because we live in a society, and in a society, it comprises of people, and so
So that's the big thing. Well, I've really enjoyed this. I think this has been a really good first talk. I'm going to get Brian in again, I reckon. On occasion, we'll come in and highlight some. But if this has generated any ideas, anyone watching or listening to this, fire questions at us, either, on my YouTube channel.
And I could mention that, like, at the moment, there is My Vote and Flux, but there hasn't really been a organization for pushing citizen juries. So if anybody are really passionate about this, like, get in touch with me and I'll try to help, like, couple together a bunch of people who are passionate and see where these guys goes.
Yeah. So via YouTube, you can find me on the social medias by searching AngryAussie. So post any questions or expressions of interest. I'll put a contact for Brian. You want to put a contact for you in the description?
Or
do you just want me to contact you?
Contact through you.
All right. So find AngryAussie on your social media.
Because I gotta sort out like setting the next event date.
All right. So contact me via any social medias if you have any interesting questions, ideas, or desire for involvement. And I can pass stuff on to Brian as well. But I'll definitely be getting back together with Brian. I've really enjoyed this first talk, and I think there's a lot more to be explored.
Definitely. Like, for example, one we could talk about in the future is the role of game design in society.
Yeah, we had a little... that's a good one.
And hostile architecture.
Oh, we had a little talk before we started, yeah.
Is there anybody who's trying to become a, like, independent game artist in the future? Perhaps, like, we could invite one.
To get someone... Yeah, look, and that's the other thing. Like, if it's... Although I do some of these, via... internet webcam hookups. If you're in Melbourne, it's easier to get together in person somewhere. Yeah, we had this very interesting conversation about how game design could reflect society.
How do we help the game designers in Australia get the games out too?
Yeah, because it's a lot of niche stuff here. But any questions, ideas, whatever, hit me up. And we'll see where we can take it in the future.
Yeah.
But I'll say bye for now.